particularly in the spots that you couldn't see when the center board was being painted. It had never been out of the boat in the 10 years since it was put in. And the way you actually deal with it when you're hauling out the boat every year is you put the boat up on blocks, or you put it in a travel lift and you lower it as much as you can, and you scrape it and paint it. Well, that's what was happening for 10 years, and it was fine, but there was significant corrosion in this particular board. And we also found out that it was much more flexible than, and that could have been a factor of the corrosion too, much more flexible than we really wanted it to be. The slot, the space the board occupies is 3 inches thick, and this one was only ½ an inch thick. So another issue is that the board would actually bounce around inside the trunk, especially when the boat was achieving any speed. If you remember anything about aerodynamics or hydrodynamics, there's swirling currents or a vortex around the very leading edge or the tip of the board. If you've ever been on an airplane and looked out the window when you're landing in fog, you can see the vortex coming off the edge of the wing. It's the wind pressure sliding down the length of the wing as well as sliding over it. So there was a lot of corrosion right at the very corner where that vortex was happening, and that piece was like, it was a piece of steel like that big that was almost completely gone. So to avoid corrosion issues in the future, to keep the board that we already had, to keep it from bouncing around inside the trunk, and to stop the vortex, we decided to glue plywood to it and fiberglass over top of it. And that way, there's no possible way that board will corrode ever again, and it becomes a very low maintenance thing. The reason that the boat never had a traditional centerboard when it was restored 10 years ago is because those are a bear to maintain. Because they have rot problems, because they're hidden up inside the boat, and you never really look at it. So the steel plate, the plywood centerboard was great in the beginning. It was a great idea, almost bomb-proof, except it broke. And the boat is so heavy in this case, anytime you run that aground, because it's just plywood, you run the risk of breaking it off. I actually did a repair job on another boat this summer, which had been launched like 2 weeks before. It was an $800,000 new construction job, and they broke the centerboard in like 2 weeks. So,
will you glass the plywood to either side?
the plywood is glued to the steel with boat life, which is like underwater adhesive,
Right.
so to speak. And then there's multiple layers of plywood, so those are glued to each other with epoxy, and then fiberglass is put completely around it.
How much room weight do you have to do that?
There's
You put
3
a quarter
inches.
inch on either
There's
side?
3 inches of space, and the board is 2 3/4.
Oh.
There's an 1/8 of an inch of space when it's finished.
That's what. So it's going to end up almost fitting.
It's going to fit the way the traditional board would have fit, right? And the point of that is to maximize the width and the thickness, because anytime you leave space, you leave the ability for things to get in there, and not only for it to vibrate, but for things to get in there and jam the board. A board like this is so heavy, it's really, really difficult to jam it. But you want to make the thing super strong too, because I've seen a boat like this capsize because it tripped over its own centerboard. When I lived in Maryland, I was at a log canoe race, and there were some skipjacks, which are boats that are descended from Long Island oyster boats, sailing, and those guys, because they're all commercial fishermen, sail their boats when they're racing like crazy people, and they're all drunk. And this particular boat was going along, was bowling along in like a 35-knot breeze. The log canoes were all capsizing, and this boat was just hauling along, and for some reason, they weren't paying attention to where they were. They had their board down too far. The boat was heeled over really hard. They hit really hard, jammed the board, and the whole boat just went right over. A boat the size of Christeen, just bloop, right over. They didn't break their board, they didn't break the boat because it was all strong.
And they spilled their beer.
And they all got wet, I'm sure they all went in the water. I mean, the guys sailing the smaller boats were all in the water. So that's what we're doing with the centerboard. It's a little bit crazy and modern and hybrid and like.
I noticed the lid ingots had ASAP on them.
Oh, those are the ballast that we took
Yeah.
out of the boat, we're actually using the ballast
Yeah, the one in
Um,
the near the bottom
to glue
says
the,
ASAP.
yeah, it's a company in Mexico, that's ballast out of Regina Maris. The big barking team that, you know, was traveling around for years and died in that particular ballast probably has been in like 4 or 5 boats because it's actually, it's a Sarco, ASARCO. It comes from Mexico, and for sure, it was not, I'd be shocked if it was put in a German ship originally, you know, whenever that boat was built, 100 years ago or something like that. So it's probably, most lead ballast ingots that are used as ballast in boats, they happen to travel around. I did another job, which I'll show you pictures of, and we needed 60,000 pounds of lead ingots, some of which we melted and cast into outside ballast keel, and the other 50,000 pounds of which we packed in by hand underneath the bottom of the boat, and we took them all out of a Liberty ship that was in Baltimore Harbor, one brick at a time. So that's the centerboard with its fiberglass, almost complete. I think we finished that today. And the idea behind that was just to make it so that it never caused a problem in the future.
You're just leaving a basic square edge to it and rounding it over?
Yeah, that's the way the traditional board would be. No nonsense, no, you know, taper or anything like that. Because the moment you start tapering it, you're going to run that part of ground and you're going to break it off. And that's because that's what they do.
Yeah.
You know. You can see pictures of the new mast. A picture of the new mast, which did we put in the? We didn't. Did we put in the pictures of the lathe? That would be a problem. This is actually kind of cool. Typically when you make a mast of any size out of a solid log, what you do is you find the tree and you bring it to the site,